Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, what is the relationship between psychopathy and murder, psychopathy and violent crime? Another question here is, what type of psychopathy is more dangerous? So psychopathy is an interesting construct, and I'll go through the types of psychopathy here and then talk about violent crime and murder. We know that psychopaths commit a disproportionately high percentage of violent crimes. And we know that there are two types of psychopathy, and it gets a little confusing sometimes because really psychopathy is on a continuum, but these two constructs have held up well over time. So most of the time somebody's going to be more so in one category than the other. Another confusing part here about psychopathy is that we have all these different names for really the same two types. So we see factor 1 and factor 2 psychopathy. We see primary and secondary, which is really the same thing. We see interpersonal affective and lifestyle antisocial. Again, the same two types. And to make it even more confusing, sometimes factor 1 psychopathy is just called psychopathy, and factor 2 psychopathy is called sociopathy. So all these are really describing, again, the same two constructs, the same two ways to categorize psychopathic characteristics. So I'm just going to refer to the two types as factor 1 and factor 2. I just find that to be the easiest way for me to say it, but again, it's important to understand there's a lot of different ways to refer to these same two types. So with factor 1 psychopathy, we see characteristics like grandiosity, which is similar to what we see with narcissism. We also see pathological lying, manipulation, a superficial charm, so somebody who's charming, but there's not a lot of sensitivity or depth behind that charm. We see being callous and unemotional, so sometimes this is thought of as low in neuroticism or a lack of empathy. We also see a lack of guilt or remorse. So all these are factor 1 psychopathy characteristics. As far as factor 2 psychopathy characteristics, we see a parasitic lifestyle, somebody who is prone to boredom, they need stimulation, sometimes this is called sensation seeking. We see impulsivity, irresponsibility, a failure to have long-term goals. We also see a number of characteristics related to criminal activity, so poor behavioral controls, not being able to control one's behavior. We see criminal versatility, and this is where somebody commits a wide variety of crimes. And when we look at factor 2 psychopathy, we see here it has a fairly close relationship to the mental disorder, antisocial personality disorder. This is a cluster B personality disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, factor 1 psychopathy could also be related to antisocial personality disorder, but factor 2 psychopathy again has the stronger link there. We study psychopathy, though, on a continuum and not categorically, meaning someone would have a particular score on an instrument that measures psychopathy, whereas antisocial personality disorder is categorical. Either somebody has a diagnosis of that disorder or they don't have a diagnosis. With these two types of psychopathy in mind, I'm now going to move over to violence and take a look at the types of violence. And interestingly, one of the popular ways, one of the common ways to look at violence is also a two-factor model. We see predatory and affective violence. So when we think of predatory violence, we think of some other related terms like proactive, the word attack, instrumental, and cold-blooded. Predatory violence is thought of as being purposeful. So somebody engages in this activity deliberately with premeditation, and they tend to lack any type of emotional display while engaging in that violent activity or while planning for that violent activity. Predatory violence also has a close relationship with sexual violence, much more so than affective violence does. Now we see with predatory violence that this reflects aggression again in the service of premeditated or anticipated goals. So it's associated with high goal-directedness and a low level of emotional arousal. We also see it's associated with low levels of intoxication. So when we think of people who are engaging in criminal activity and there's this intoxication component that's contributing to that, we're not really thinking about predatory violence here. So predatory violence has a strong relationship with factor 1 psychopathy, that callous, unemotional type psychopathy. Now we move over to affective violence. We see some words here associated with this type of violence, like impulsive, defensive, hot-blooded, as opposed to cold-blooded that we saw with predatory violence. And we also see the word reactive. So this type of violence really reflects an act of aggression in response to a perceived threat. It doesn't have to be an actual threat, but rather just the perception that a threat is there. We see that these acts are typically emotionally charged and seem relatively uncontrolled when compared to the acts of violence that would be categorized as predatory. We also see that affective violence is essentially an attempt at threat reduction. Again, even if that threat isn't real, that is really underlying this idea of affective violence. So not surprisingly, here we see low goal-directedness and a high level of emotional arousal, and we also see higher levels of intoxication associated with affective violence. So in terms of psychopathy, factor 2 psychopathy has a strong relationship with affective violence. So factor 1 psychopathy tends to be predatory, and factor 2 psychopathy tends to be affective. So with all this in mind, which type of psychopath is more dangerous? Well, as you might imagine, it really depends on a lot of factors here. I would say that both types are dangerous, but in different ways. If we look at the tendencies, the general tendencies. So a factor 1 psychopath would be more dangerous to a stranger, right? So they typically don't attack people that they know. They tend to target strangers. A factor 2 psychopath would be more dangerous to somebody that they know, and particularly dangerous if there's some sort of emotionally charged relationship there. So, for example, a romantic partner. They would be more dangerous, again, all things being equal. They would be more dangerous than a factor 1 psychopath to somebody that they're involved in a romantic relationship with. Also, a factor 2 psychopath would be more dangerous if they are intoxicated. So, again, all psychopathy comes with some level of danger, but we see different targets in terms of violence, different types of violence, and different circumstances under which somebody has a tendency to be violent. Again, like intoxication. So I used a few different sources for this video, and I'll put the references to those articles in the description for this video. And one really looked at psychopathic murders, which was another part of this question, or another question kind of related to this video. Now this sample came from Finland, so you can't necessarily look at these results and apply them to everywhere in the world. But it's actually a really interesting study, and it looked at how individuals with high psychopathy scores who committed murder were different than individuals with low psychopathy scores that committed murder. So with this comparison, we see individuals with high psychopathy scores that committed murder were more likely to leave the scene of the killing, more likely to deny the charges, more likely to claim self-defense as the primary reason for the killing. Now, of course, self-defense does occur legitimately in many instances, but here we're talking about people that were known to have committed murder. So the authorities knew these people committed murder, and the murderers still said that self-defense was really the reason behind the killing. We also see here they tend to be convicted of a less serious crime, which indicates that they're able to manipulate the system pretty well. And this has actually been shown a few times in a few different studies. Psychopaths lie and manipulate and can trick people in the criminal justice system. They can trick police officers, judges, attorneys, as well as a number of other people that work in the criminal justice system and in law enforcement. And there are actually a number of different theories about how they do this so effectively. One of the theories is that people in the criminal justice system, people who work in the criminal justice system, seem to believe, again, overall, there's a tendency, they seem to believe they have an ability to detect lying that's better than average. And of course, from the scientific literature, we know that's not true. Their ability is actually the same as everyone else's. Generally, we're not very good at detecting lying, particularly when dealing with somebody who has psychopathic characteristics, because they're very effective at lying and manipulation. The problem is that a number of people in the criminal justice system have high confidence about their ability to detect lies. So they believe they have an ability that they don't have. And this confidence only adds to the ability of the psychopath to deceive them. Again, because people in the criminal justice system believe their assessment about somebody's deception is accurate, and they're not really clearly seeing when they're being deceived. So this really is an important reminder that we have to be skeptical even about our own abilities. So if we think we have a particular ability to see when people are lying, to know what people are doing, to read people's behavior, to think that we understand what they're thinking, we need to be skeptical. There's not a lot of evidence to show that individuals are effective at uncovering the lies and the manipulation attempts that we see with psychopathy. So we really have to be careful and somewhat skeptical. Being overconfident can actually lead to individuals who are psychopathic getting early release, or again being convicted of less serious crime, or beating charges altogether. So when we think about predatory versus affective violence, and we think about psychopathic murders, a lot of the characteristics of psychopathic murders kind of make sense in that predatory affective framework, and again in the framework of Factor 1 and Factor 2 psychopathy. So it shouldn't be surprising that somebody who's psychopathic lies about committing a murder. The tendency, of course, would be that they would lie about a wide variety of circumstances. So again, it wouldn't be surprising that they would lie about a homicide that they were involved in. So of course, when we talk about psychopathy and criminal justice and violent crimes and murder, we know these are serious issues. And there have been many attempts to treat psychopaths, to help them to become functional members of society and to not involve themselves in violence. What's interesting here, of course, is that some of these treatments have been somewhat effective, but many have not been effective, and some have actually made things worse. We see here that some of the interventions tend to have paradoxical effects. So when we look at treating psychopaths, especially when looking at violent crime and violent recidivism, we see that insight-oriented therapy, and we know a lot of counseling is based on insight, as well as group therapy interventions, actually tend to help psychopaths develop better ways of manipulating, using people, and deceiving, including the staff that's delivering the therapy. And unfortunately, they're not really learning a lot about themselves, referring to the psychopaths here. So they gain some manipulation skill, but don't tend to gain the insight. So there's not really an offset. So you might say, well, if they're gaining some ability to manipulate, but they're learning a lot about themselves, maybe it's worth the trade-off. But here we're not really seeing a good trade-off. What's more, psychopaths tend to manipulate staff into thinking that they've made good progress and therefore are good candidates for early release. And a lot of times we see staff really supporting psychopaths in terms of early release. They look at them and say, well, they're rehabilitated, and they go to bat for them, so to speak. So again, there's a real danger to falling into this manipulation, to not being aware that this manipulation is likely when somebody has psychopathic tendencies. So if insight-oriented therapy is not really helpful for psychopathy, what would be? So again, a lot of therapies target around changing somebody's personality, like helping them to develop empathy, but this doesn't seem to be working. So now we see a lot of research focused on behavioral changes, behavioral self-management, so promoting a more pro-social lifestyle in a sense of logistics of cost-benefit and not in terms of interpersonal change, not in terms of personality change. Really just looking at the cost and benefits of violence compared to nonviolence. So really trying to convince individuals who are in the criminal justice system and who have psychopathic tendencies that nonviolence can help them meet their goals more effectively than violence can. So if they want certain things out of life and they play by the rules, including nonviolence, they'll get further. That's really the whole idea behind some of these behavioral strategies. Not that we should necessarily give up on helping somebody to change personality characteristics or give up on the value of insight, but we have to be realistic about manipulation and deception and understand that we don't want to help people develop these skills. We don't want people to get more invested. We don't want psychopaths to get more invested in their ability to deceive and refine that to a point where it becomes even harder to catch them and prosecute them and treat them. So an important note here when talking about psychopathy and crime and all this, we are talking about here individuals who are psychopathic to a fairly extreme degree. Psychopathy is something we see in the general population quite often, and most people that have psychopathic characteristics are not a danger to anyone. Some psychopathic characteristics in certain situations are actually beneficial. They actually help certain types of professionals do their jobs. What we're really talking about here is when somebody has a very high score on a psychopathic inventory of some type, a psychometric instrument designed to measure psychopathy. A score that would fall in a range where we know that treatment is indicated in almost every instance. So again, not talking about psychopathy in general, but these extreme instances of psychopathy that seem to be quite overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So the levels of psychopathy that are strongly associated with criminal offending. So I know whenever I talk about psychopathy and violent crime and murder and the types of psychopathy, there are going to be a variety of opinions. If you agree or disagree with me in a certain area in terms of what I talked about in this video, or you have other opinions, please put those in the comments. I always enjoy seeing the dialogue that emerges from these types of topics. As always, I hope you found this description of psychopathy and violent crime to be interesting. Thanks for watching.